A question gets typed into a chatbot. Nothing unusual about that. Millions happen every hour. But this one didn't come back with a shrug or a disclaimer. It came back with a structure, a timeline, a number that, depending on how you read it, lands somewhere uncomfortably close to right now. The question was simple. What does the Book of Enoch say about the year 2026? The book itself never mentions 2026. It couldn't. It's roughly 2,000 years old. But the way the AI worked through the text, pulling threads from 5 different sections, running the math on a number that shows up exactly once, and laying it against real history, is why the exchange spread the way it did. Not because it was dramatic, because it looked methodical. This video is not going to tell you the world ends in 2026. It's not going to tell you it doesn't. What it's going to do is walk through what the Book of Enoch actually says, why it disappeared from most Bibles, what a language model can and can't legitimately do with a text like this, and where the line sits between real textual analysis and a machine finding shapes in clouds. By the end, you'll have enough to decide for yourself whether this is a coincidence worth ignoring or a pattern worth sitting with. Start with the basics, because most of the argument online happens between people who have never opened the book. The Book of Enoch, technically one Enoch, to distinguish it from later texts that borrowed the name, is a collection of Jewish religious writings generally dated to somewhere between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century BCE, compiled from several originally separate documents. It's attributed to Enoch, a figure from the book of Genesis, who appears for exactly a handful of verses. Genesis says Enoch walked with God, and then, unlike everyone else in that genealogy, he doesn't die. The text says God took him, Genesis 5 verse 24. That one strange exit is most of why later Jewish and Christian tradition treated him as someone who had been shown things ordinary people hadn't. One Enoch is usually broken into 5 sections, sometimes called the Pentateuch of Enoch, chapters 1 to 36. Which tells the story of angelic beings called watchers who descend to earth, take human wives, and father a race of giants called the Nephilim, or similitudes, chapters 37 to 71, which introduces messianic and judgment themes, including the title Son of Man, chapters 72 to 82, a technical section describing a 364-day solar calendar and the movements of sun, moon, and stars, chapters 83 to 90. Which includes the animal apocalypse, a symbolic retelling of biblical history using animals to represent people and nations. Chapters 91 to 108, which contains the apocalypse of weeks, a scheme dividing history into 10 symbolic weeks, along with ethical exhortations to the righteous. That's the skeleton. Everything the internet argues about, giants, forbidden knowledge, judgment, calendars, timelines, comes out of these 5 blocks of text. If the book was significant enough to be copied and preserved for 2,000 years, why isn't it sitting next to Genesis and Exodus in the Bible on your shelf? The short answer is that canon formation was slow, regional, and never a single vote. Different Jewish and Christian communities across different centuries and different languages arrived at different lists of authoritative texts. One Enoch wasn't rejected in one dramatic decision. It simply didn't make the final cut in the traditions that became mainstream rabbinic Judaism, Catholicism, and most of Protestantism. That doesn't mean it was obscure. Fragments of Enoch turned up among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, discovered starting in 1947. The community there, generally identified with the Essenes, preserved Aramaic copies of the text, which tell scholars it was being actively read and valued centuries before Christianity existed. The New Testament's Epistle of Jude, verses 14 to 15, directly quotes a prophecy attributed to Enoch, which is strong evidence that at least some early Christian communities knew the text well. Early Christian writers like Tertullian referenced it. Others, like Augustine, later argued against treating it as scripture. The one major exception is the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, which has kept one Enoch in its biblical canon continuously. And it's largely because of Ethiopian manuscripts, written in Guizi, the classical Ethiopic language, that the complete text survived at all. The Aramaic Dead Sea fragments only cover portions of the book. The full text as we have it today comes almost entirely from that Ethiopian tradition. So the honest historical picture is this: a real ancient text, read and referenced by real ancient communities, excluded from most later canons through an uneven, centuries-long process, and preserved whole by one church that never let it go. Nothing about that history is mysterious or suppressed. It's just a long, ordinary story about how canons form, told about a text with an unusually dramatic subject. Here's where it gets interesting. And here's where it's important to be precise about what an AI system like Grok can and cannot legitimately claim. A large language model doesn't have independent access to hidden knowledge. It works from patterns in the text it's given and the material it was trained on. When asked to connect the Book of Enoch's internal structure to a modern date, what it's actually doing is textual pattern matching at scale, reading the book as a connected whole, identifying numerically or structurally significant details, and testing different ways of mapping those details onto known history. That's a legitimate literary exercise. Biblical scholars do versions of it constantly. The difference is that a model can do it exhaustively and instantly, across every chapter, without getting tired or losing the thread. What it cannot do is verify a hidden meaning, access authorial intent that isn't recoverable from the text, or produce a result that counts as evidence rather than interpretation. Every output is only as good as the assumptions fed into it, and with an ancient apocalyptic text, those assumptions multiply fast. With that caveat sitting up front, here's what the analysis actually worked through. Chapter 10 of 1 Enoch contains the detail nearly every 2026 discussion centers on. After the Watchers corrupt humanity, the text describes the archangels binding the leader of the Watchers, Azazel, and casting him into darkness till the day of the great judgment, while the rest are imprisoned for 70 generations, till the eternal judgment is consummated. 1 Enoch 10 to 11. 12 per R.H. Charles's classic translation. 70 generations is the only number in the entire book that behaves like a countdown. It has a starting event, the imprisonment, and an ending event, the final judgment. Naturally, people have spent a very long time trying to convert it into years. The problem is that the text never defines what a generation is. So every conversion requires an imported assumption. Closer to a modern demographic average, gives roughly 1,400 years, which places the endpoint deep in antiquity long before now, and forces the conclusion that either the number is symbolic or the judgment already happened by some readings. Closer to some ancient reckonings, gives about 2,100 years, landing somewhere in the medieval to early modern range, depending on the starting point. The figure the Hebrew Bible often uses to mark a generation in the wilderness narratives, Numbers 32 to 13, gives 2,800 years, which, depending on where you anchor the start, can be stretched to reach the present day. Every one of those models is internally consistent. None of them is more correct than the others, because the text simply doesn't supply the missing variable. This is the honest, scholarly conclusion. And it's also the conclusion any AI analysis worth trusting would have to reach. The 70 generations figure is suggestive, not calculable. Any claim that it points precisely at 2026 depends entirely on which unstated assumption you choose to plug in, which means the prediction is really a reflection of the assumption, not the text. The part of the Book of Enoch that tends to unsettle modern readers isn't the giants. It's the list of things the Watchers taught humanity. Chapter 8 catalogs it directly. Azazel teaches metalworking, weapon-making, and the crafting of ornaments and cosmetics. Other Watchers teach the cutting of roots and knowledge of plants, incantations, astrology, and the reading of omens. The text is explicit that this knowledge, arriving in human hands too early and without any accompanying wisdom, is what accelerates violence and corruption on earth. 1 Enoch 8:1-9:6. Read symbolically, which is how the overwhelming majority of modern scholars read it. This section functions as an ancient meditation on a very old anxiety, capability outpacing the wisdom needed to control it. That anxiety isn't unique to Enoch. It shows up in the Prometheus myth, in the Tower of Babel narrative, in countless origin stories about power arriving before responsibility. It's not hard to see why a system trained on enormous amounts of contemporary discussion about artificial intelligence would draw the comparison itself. Prominent AI researchers and organizations, including Anthropic and OpenAI, have publicly and repeatedly said some version of the same thing, that the pace of capability development is outstripping the pace of safety research, governance, and regulation. That's a genuinely documented, widely discussed concern in the AI field. It isn't a fringe theory, and it isn't something the model had to invent. What's speculative is the leap from this ancient warning resembles a modern anxiety to this ancient warning is about this specific modern technology. That leap is interpretation, not discovery, and any honest analysis has to say so plainly. The Astronomical Book, chapter 72 through 82, is the part of 1 Enoch almost nobody quotes in these discussions, and it's arguably the most important section for anyone trying to pin an ancient timeline to a modern date. It describes a 364-day solar calendar, for seasons of 91 days each season built from 3 months, 2 of 30 days, 1 of 31, with a total dividing evenly by 7. That evenness is the point. In this system, festivals always fall on the same day of the week, year after year, with no drift. Scholars widely believe this calendar, or something close to it, was used by the Qumran community and appears in the related Book of Jubilees. Disputes over calendars were a real and documented source of sectarian division in Second Temple Judaism, because a fixed solar calendar puts sacred festivals on different days than the lunar-influenced calendar used elsewhere. The reason this matters for any 2026 claim is straightforward. The modern world runs on the Gregorian calendar, a solar calendar with leap year corrections that has no clean mathematical relationship to Enoch's 364-day system. Converting between the two isn't a matter of simple arithmetic. It requires choosing a starting anchor point in history, and different anchor points can shift the final answer by years or even decades. This is precisely the honest reason no serious biblical chronologist claims to convert Enoch's timeline into an exact modern date. Any AI-generated conversion inherits that same uncertainty, whether or not it says so out loud. The final structure worth understanding is the apocalypse of weeks, found in the Epistle of Enoch. Here, week doesn't mean 7 days. It means a symbolic era, and the whole of human history is divided into 10 of them. The 8th week is described as a week of righteousness, in which a sword is given to the righteous to execute judgment on oppressors. The 9th week is when righteous judgment is revealed to the whole world and the deeds of the wicked are recorded for destruction. 1 Enoch 91:12-14. If someone wanted to argue the present moment sits inside this framework, they could plausibly place it somewhere in the 8th or 9th week. But this is exactly where the deepest caution belongs. The historical record shows that essentially every generation that has read this text closely has found a way to place itself near the climax of the sequence. The Qumran community believed they were living in the final age. So did various medieval and Reformation-era readers. Every one of them was, from where we stand now, wrong about the timing. The sequence, whatever it describes, continued past them. That pattern alone should be the loudest signal in this entire discussion. A framework flexible enough to fit every generation that has ever read it is not, by itself, evidence about any particular one. It's worth separating fact from interpretation one final time, cleanly. 1 Enoch is a real ancient text. Portions were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserves it as scripture, and is the reason the complete text survives. The Epistle of Jude quotes it directly. The book contains a 364-day calendar, a 70 generations imprisonment motif, and a 10-part historical framework called the Apocalypse of Weeks. AI researchers and companies have publicly and repeatedly voiced concern that AI capability is advancing faster than safety and governance frameworks. Any specific conversion of 70 generations into a modern year. Any claim that the Watcher's narrative is about artificial intelligence specifically, rather than resembling a general pattern of capability outpacing wisdom. Any placement of 2026 or any other specific year inside the 8th or 9th symbolic week. Any claim that an AI system has uncovered a hidden or previously unknown meaning in the text. An AI model can process the entire Book of Enoch faster and more exhaustively than any single human reader ever could. and it can surface genuinely interesting structural connections in the process. What it cannot do is resolve 2,000-year-old ambiguities that biblical scholars, working with the same text, still argue about today. Pattern recognition is powerful, and pattern recognition will also, reliably, find patterns that aren't really there if you point it at something ambiguous enough and ask it to. None of this requires you to dismiss the Book of Enoch as meaningless, and none of it requires you to treat it as a literal countdown clock either. Both of those reactions skip the actual work, which is reading the thing for yourself. The full text is publicly available in multiple English translations, most based on R.H. Charles's early 20th century edition, or more recent scholarly translations, like George Nicholsburg's. What's genuinely true is this: a 2,000-year-old text, excluded from most Bibles, preserved almost single-handedly by one church, is now getting run through modern AI systems by people looking for meaning in the specific moment we're living through. That says at least as much about us, about what we're anxious about right now, as it does about the book itself. Whether the 70 generations line up with anything real, or whether this is simply what pattern recognition does when pointed at ambiguous ancient material, is a question worth sitting with rather than settling in a headline. Read the primary sources. Read the scholars who disagree with each other. Then decide for yourself.